Daniel Whitfield sat in his car outside the law office with a folder of divorce papers on the passenger seat, and his hands would not stop shaking. He had just signed the first set of documents. The ink was barely dry. His lawyer, a calm woman named Patricia Doyle, had told him that once he handed the second copy to his wife, there was no easy way to take it back. Daniel had nodded as if that made things simple. It did not feel simple at all. He looked at the folder for a long moment before starting the engine. 6 years of marriage sat inside that thin stack of paper. 6 years that had somehow turned into silence, missed dinners, and a woman he barely recognized anymore. It had not always been like this. When Daniel first met Claire, she used to laugh so loudly in restaurants that strangers would turn and smile. She used to leave little notes in his lunch bag before he left for work. She used to call him 3 times a day just to hear his voice. Somewhere along the way, all of that had stopped, and Daniel could not say exactly when. The last few months had been the worst. Claire had grown distant, tired, and short-tempered. She canceled their anniversary dinner at the last minute, saying she had a headache. Then Daniel saw her getting into a taxi an hour later, dressed nicely, without telling him where she was going. She took phone calls in the bathroom with the door locked. She spent money from their joint account without explanation, thousands of dollars over the past 2 months, and when Daniel asked about it, she snapped at him and walked away. He had tried to talk to her about it more than once. Every conversation ended the same way, with Claire saying she was tired or busy or that he was imagining things. Daniel was not imagining things. He had seen the bank statements. He had seen the missed calls from a number he did not recognize, saved simply as M in her phone. He had seen the way she flinched whenever he walked into a room where she was talking on the phone. His best friend, Patrick Nolan, had told him weeks ago that something was clearly wrong, and that Daniel deserved honesty, not silence. Patrick had been the one who suggested he speak to a lawyer, just to understand his options. Daniel had resisted the idea at first. He loved Claire, or at least he loved the woman she used to be. But love, he had decided somewhere between the second and third unexplained absence, was not enough if it was only coming from one side. Daniel drove home slowly that evening, the folder resting on the seat beside him like a silent passenger. The sky had turned a deep orange, the kind of color that used to make Claire stop and take a picture just because it was beautiful. Daniel did not stop. He kept driving, replaying the last conversation with his lawyer in his mind. Patricia had told him to be calm when he told Claire, to avoid raising his voice, to let her react however she needed to react. Daniel had agreed to all of it. He wanted this to be over as quietly as possible. When he pulled into the driveway of their small house on Ferndale Street, the porch light was already on. Claire's car was parked in its usual spot. Daniel sat in his own car for a minute, staring at the front door, gathering whatever courage he had left. Tonight, he told himself, tonight he would tell her everything. No more waiting. No more pretending that things were fine when they were clearly not. He picked up the folder, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the house. His footsteps felt heavier than usual, as if the concrete path had grown longer since that morning. He reached the door, put his hand on the handle, and paused. Through the window beside the door, he could see the kitchen light was on. Claire was standing near the counter with her phone pressed to her ear. Her back was turned to him. She had not heard the car pull in, or if she had not looked up. Daniel did not open the door right away. Something about the way Claire was standing made him hesitate. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, the way they always were when she was upset. One hand gripped the edge of the counter tightly. Daniel could hear her voice through the thin glass of the window, quiet at first, then rising. He should have opened the door. He should have walked in, made his presence known, and said what he came to say. Instead, he found himself standing frozen on the porch, listening. "Mom, please, just listen to me for a second," Claire said, her voice cracking slightly. There was a pause, and then she continued, quieter this time, as if she was afraid someone might hear her, though she clearly had no idea Daniel was standing just outside the door. "I know how it looks. I know what you think I should do, but I can't just leave him right now, not after everything." Daniel's chest tightened. He had come home tonight ready to end the marriage himself, papers in hand, and now he was hearing his wife's mother apparently telling her the exact same thing. He should have felt relief. If Claire's own mother believed she should leave him, then maybe this decision was not as unfair as he had feared. Maybe everyone around them could see what he had been seeing for months. And yet, standing there in the cool evening air, folder pressed against his side, Daniel felt something else entirely. A strange, sinking unease settled in his stomach, the kind of feeling a person gets right before they realize they have misunderstood something important. Claire's voice dropped even lower, and Daniel had to lean closer to the window to catch her next words. "You don't understand what he's been going through," she said. "If I tell him now, it will destroy him. I need more time. Just a little more time, and then I'll explain everything, I promise." Daniel stood completely still, his hand still resting on the door handle, the folder of divorce papers suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in his other hand. He had walked up to that door certain of one thing, that his marriage was over, and that Claire had been hiding something from him that could only mean betrayal. But the words drifting out through that thin pane of glass did not sound like the words of a woman hiding an affair. They sounded like something else entirely, something Daniel could not yet name, and the not knowing was almost worse than anything he had imagined before. He should have walked inside right then. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, his heart pounding, waiting to hear what his wife would say next. Daniel's mind raced back through the past few months, searching for some new way to understand everything he had witnessed. The missed dinner, the taxi ride to nowhere he could explain, the locked bathroom door and the hushed calls, the missing money from their joint account. He had built an entire story in his head, piece by piece, until it had felt solid enough to walk into a lawyer's office and sign his name to it. Now, standing outside his own front door, that story was beginning to crack apart, and he did not yet have anything solid to replace it with. He thought about calling out to her, announcing that he was home, letting the moment pass so he could gather himself before speaking to her directly. But some part of him needed to know more first. If Claire was hiding a decision that could end their marriage, he wanted to understand exactly what she was protecting him from before he made his own choice permanent. Inside the kitchen, Claire shifted her weight from one foot to the other, still gripping the phone. Daniel could see her reflection faintly in the dark window glass beside the front door, her face pale under the kitchen light, her eyes red as though she had been crying earlier and had only just managed to stop. "I'm not asking you to agree with me, Mom," Claire said, her voice trembling now. "I'm asking you to trust that I know him better than anyone. He's not a bad man. He's scared and he's proud, and if I tell him the truth right now, in the middle of everything else, I don't know what it will do to him." There was a pause on Claire's end while her mother spoke. Daniel strained to hear, but Margaret's voice on the other end of the line was too faint to make out clearly through the glass. He could only guess at what was being said based on Claire's reactions, the way her jaw tightened, the way she pressed her free hand against her forehead as if trying to hold something together. "I know it's not fair to me," Claire finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I'm exhausted. I know I look terrible and I've been distant and short with him, and I hate that he probably thinks the worst of me right now. But what choice do I have? If I say the wrong thing, I could lose everything I've been trying so hard to fix." Daniel felt his stomach twist. Lose everything. What did that mean? For weeks he had assumed the worst explanation possible. The kind of thing men assume when their wives grow distant and secretive. But the words filtering through the window did not sound like the confession of someone unfaithful. They sounded like the words of someone carrying a weight alone, someone trying, in her own complicated way, to protect him from something rather than betray him. He thought of the folder in his hand, the neat stack of legal papers with his signature already on the first page. An hour ago, it had felt like the only reasonable next step, the only way to protect himself from more uncertainty. Now it felt like a decision made in the dark, without half the facts, and Daniel was not sure he could forgive himself if he walked inside and handed it to her without knowing the truth first. The porch light flickered slightly above him, and for a moment Daniel worried Claire might glance toward the door and notice his silhouette through the glass. He stepped back instinctively, pressing himself against the wall beside the window, still listening, still frozen between two versions of the same evening. One version had him walking calmly into the kitchen and ending his marriage. The other had him standing exactly where he was now, waiting, because some instinct told him that whatever Claire said next would change everything he thought he understood about the past 3 months. Her voice rose slightly again, and this time there was no mistaking the emotion behind it. You don't know what it's like watching him worry about money every single night and not being able to tell him why it's actually worse than he thinks, Claire said. I'm doing this for him, Mom. I need you to understand that. Everything I've done these past 2 months, all of it has been for him, even if he never finds out. Daniel's hand slipped slowly off the door handle. Whatever he had expected to hear tonight, it was not this. Daniel stayed pressed against the wall beside the window, his breath shallow, waiting for Claire to say more. Through the glass, he watched her set the phone down on the counter for a moment, both hands braced against the edge as if she needed the support just to remain standing. Then she picked it back up and pressed it to her ear again. I'm not finished, Mom, she said. Please don't hang up on me. I need you to hear the rest of it because I haven't told anyone else and I can't keep carrying this by myself. Margaret said something on the other end and Claire nodded slowly, even though her mother could not see her. You're right, I should have told him from the beginning, she said. But you know how he gets when the shop struggles. You remember what happened after his father passed away. He stopped eating properly for 2 weeks. He barely spoke to anyone. I couldn't do that to him again, not with everything else going on. Daniel felt his throat tighten at the mention of his father. It had been almost a year since his father, Walter Whitfield, passed away after a long illness, leaving behind a modest hardware shop on Corbin Avenue that Daniel had taken over out of duty more than desire. Business had been difficult since then. Rent on the shop had increased. A large supplier had raised prices without warning. Daniel had been quietly struggling to keep the shop afloat for months, telling himself things would improve, telling Claire even less than that. He had assumed she barely noticed. Now, listening to her voice crack through the kitchen window, he realized she had noticed everything. 2 months ago I found the letter from the bank, Claire continued. The one about the loan on the shop. Daniel never showed it to me. I found it by accident when I was looking for his insurance documents. It said if he missed another payment, they were going to start foreclosure proceedings on the shop building. Daniel's stomach dropped. He remembered that letter. He had shoved it into the bottom drawer of his desk at the shop, telling himself he would deal with it once sales picked up in the new season. He had never imagined Claire had seen it. I didn't tell him I found it, Claire said, her voice unsteady. I didn't know how to bring it up without him feeling like I was checking up on him, or worse, like I was disappointed in him for not being able to save the shop his father built. So instead, I started looking for a way to fix it quietly, before it became a real problem he'd have to face. There was a pause while Margaret spoke again. Claire shook her head firmly. No, Mom, I couldn't ask you and Dad for money. You already helped us with the wedding and I know what it did to your savings. I wasn't going to ask again, not for something this big. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, his mind spinning. All the strange absences, all the unexplained taxi rides, all the withdrawals from their joint account, everything he had cataloged as evidence of an affair now seemed to be forming an entirely different picture, one he had never once considered. I picked up a second job, Claire said quietly. At Larkspur Medical Center, 3 nights a week, doing overnight administrative work at the front desk. That's where I've been going after he thinks I'm asleep, or on the nights I told him I had headaches and needed to lie down early. I took the overnight shifts because they pay more, and because he'd never notice me leaving that late if I timed it right. Daniel's chest ached as pieces began sliding into place. The exhaustion in her face every morning. The way she sometimes fell asleep at the dinner table before 9 at night, or seemed disoriented when he called her name twice before she responded. He had noticed all of it and interpreted it as distance, as disinterest, as the slow death of whatever affection they once had for each other. He had never once considered that his wife might simply be running herself into the ground trying to save something he did not even know was breaking. "The taxi you're asking about was to the shipping company downtown," Claire went on. "I sold my grandmother's jewelry, Mom. The set she left me, the one with the sapphire earrings you always said I should keep for my own daughter one day. I sold it 3 weeks ago to a buyer across town, and I used a taxi because I didn't want Daniel to see the box in the car and start asking questions before I was ready to explain everything." Daniel felt something crack open in his chest, a mixture of guilt and disbelief so strong that his knees nearly buckled. He remembered Claire wearing those earrings on their wedding day, remembered her crying happy tears when her grandmother placed them in her hands years before that, remembered how carefully she used to store them in a small velvet box on her dresser. He had never noticed they were missing. He had been too consumed by his own frustration to notice much of anything about her at all these past few months. "The money from the earrings and the extra job covered part of what he owed," Claire said. "But it wasn't enough. That's why I've been taking money out of our joint account, small amounts each time so it wouldn't look strange, and putting it toward a private arrangement with the bank to delay the foreclosure by another 60 days. I told the loan officer I needed time to help my husband restructure the debt without him finding out how close we came to losing everything his father built." Margaret's voice rose audibly this time, sharp enough that Daniel caught a few scattered words through the glass, though not enough to form a full sentence. Claire's response came quickly, defensive but tired. "I know it sounds insane when you say it out loud. I know most people would think I should have told him the moment I found that letter. But you didn't see his face at the funeral, Mom. You didn't see how much it meant to him to keep that shop running, like it was the last piece of his father he had left. I couldn't be the one to tell him he might lose it too." Daniel pressed his free hand against his mouth to keep from making any sound. Every accusation he had silently built against her over the past 2 months, every suspicion, every cold assumption, was unraveling in real time, replaced by something far harder to sit with. The realization that while he had been quietly preparing to end their marriage, his wife had been quietly working herself past exhaustion trying to save the one thing she believed mattered most to him. "There's something else," Claire said, and something in her tone shifted, becoming even more careful, even more afraid. "It's about Nathan." Daniel frowned at the sound of his younger brother's name. Nathan Whitfield had always been the more reckless of the two brothers, prone to poor decisions and expensive mistakes, though Daniel had assumed his brother's troubles were mostly behind him since he had moved out of state 2 years earlier for a fresh start. "He called me last month, not Daniel," Claire said. "He said he didn't want to worry Daniel with it, not after everything with the shop, but he owes money to some very serious people, Mom. Not a bank, not a normal loan. People who don't send polite letters when payments are late." Daniel's blood ran cold. He had not spoken to Nathan in almost 3 weeks, and their last conversation had seemed ordinary enough, nothing hinting at trouble of that magnitude. "He asked me not to tell Daniel because he was ashamed," Clea continued, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "But the men he owes money to have already called our house twice this month, Mom. I picked up both times before Daniel got home from the shop. They didn't threaten me directly, but the way they spoke, the things they implied about consequences if Nathan doesn't pay soon, it terrified me. I've been trying to help him quietly too, sending him what I can from the overnight job money, hoping it buys him enough time to sort things out properly." Daniel's mind reeled. The locked bathroom door calls. The strange missed number saved only as M in her phone, which he now realized with a jolt might not stand for a stranger's name at all, but for Margaret, her own mother, called so often lately that Clea had probably stopped thinking to change the contact name back to something more familiar. "I was going to tell him everything this weekend," Clea said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Both things, the shop and Nathan. I already spoke to a financial advisor about consolidating the debt properly, the legal way, instead of me quietly bleeding money out of accounts and selling jewelry like some kind of secret agent. I just needed a few more days to have real solutions ready before I told him how bad things actually were, so it wouldn't feel like I was only bringing him more bad news with nothing to fix it." There was a long pause on Clea's end while her mother spoke again, and this time Clea let out a broken, exhausted laugh that had no real joy in it at all. "No, Mom, I'm not a saint. I'm just scared. I'm scared of losing the shop that means everything to him. I'm scared of what could happen to Nathan if he doesn't pay these people soon. And most of all, I'm scared that, when Daniel finally learns how long I kept all of this from him, he won't understand why, and he'll think I was hiding something far worse than the truth." Daniel stood frozen outside his own front door, the folder of divorce papers hanging loosely from his fingers, feeling as though the ground beneath him had shifted entirely. An hour ago he had been certain he understood his marriage well enough to end it. Now he understood he had not understood anything at all. Inside the kitchen, Clea wiped at her eyes with the back of her free hand, still holding the phone tightly to her ear as she paced a small circle near the counter. Daniel watched her through the glass, seeing her clearly now in a way he had somehow failed to see her for months, not as a distant, distracted wife slipping away from him, but as someone stretched thin in every direction, trying to hold together pieces of a life that had quietly become far more fragile than he had ever realized. "I know you think I should have told him the second I found that bank letter," Clea said, her voice steadier now, though still edged with exhaustion. "But you didn't grow up watching your father lose everything the way I did, Mom. You know how that shaped me. I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to stop someone I love from going through that same thing, I would do everything in my power to protect them from it, even if it meant carrying the weight myself for a while." Margaret's voice came through faintly again, softer this time, and Clea's shoulders dropped slightly, as though some of the tension had finally begun to ease from her body. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I needed to hear that. I know I probably look like I'm falling apart right now. I probably am a little. I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night in almost 3 weeks." Daniel's chest tightened painfully at those words. He thought back to countless mornings over the past month when he had rolled over in bed to find Clea's side already empty, the sheets cool, and he had assumed she had simply woken early out of habit, or perhaps out of a growing preference for being anywhere other than beside him. It had never once occurred to him that she might have been arriving home from an overnight shift only an hour or two before he woke, slipping quietly back into bed just long enough to appear as though she had been there all along. "I keep telling myself it's almost over," Clea continued. "The financial advisor said if I can get through this next round of payments, the restructuring plan will hold, and the shop will be safe. And Nathan says he's found a way to pay off most of what he owes by the end of next month, so as long as nothing goes wrong before then, both things should resolve around the same time." She paused, listening, then let out a soft, tired sigh. "I know it sounds like I've been juggling too much at once. I have been. But what was I supposed to do, Mom? Sit back and watch Daniel lose the last piece of his father he has left, or watch his little brother get hurt over money, all while pretending everything is fine because I didn't want to add to his stress? I couldn't do that. I love him too much to just stand by." Daniel felt something in his chest give way entirely at those words, a mixture of shame and disbelief so overwhelming that he had to lean his forehead briefly against the cool brick wall beside the window just to steady himself. He thought of the folder still gripped in his other hand, heavy now not with legal weight, but with the crushing realization of how close he had come to destroying something built out of quiet, exhausting love, simply because he had misread every sign of that love as its absence. "I'm going to tell him everything this weekend," Clea said again, more firmly this time, as though repeating it aloud helped her believe it. All of it, the shop, Nathan, the overnight job, the jewelry, all of it. I just wanted to walk in with solutions already in place instead of just more problems piled on top of what he's already carrying. I didn't want him to feel like the only thing I brought him was bad news. There was a brief silence while Margaret spoke once more. Clea nodded slowly, even though her mother could not see the gesture. "You're probably right," she said. "Maybe I should have trusted him with this from the very beginning instead of trying to fix everything alone. I just kept thinking about how proud he is, and how much it would hurt him to feel like he needed saving. I didn't want him to feel weak. I wanted him to feel like none of this had ever come close to touching him at all." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of the past 2 months settle over him differently now, no longer as evidence of betrayal, but as evidence of a kind of devotion he had never fully appreciated until this very moment, standing outside his own front door with a stack of unsigned divorce papers trembling in his hand. "I should go, Mom," Clea said after a moment. "He'll be home soon and I don't want him walking in on me looking like this. I'll call you tomorrow after my shift, all right? And please don't worry so much. I promise I'm handling it." Daniel heard the small beep of the call ending, followed by a long, shaky exhale from inside the kitchen. Through the window, he watched Clea set the phone down on the counter, brace both hands against the edge, and lower her head for a moment, as though gathering whatever strength she had left before facing the rest of her evening. Daniel stood frozen on the porch, the folder still hanging from his fingers, his mind a chaotic blend of guilt, relief, disbelief, and something that felt uncomfortably close to shame. He had walked up to this door tonight fully prepared to end his marriage over assumptions he had never once bothered to question. Now, hearing the truth pour out of his wife in a moment she believed was entirely private, he understood that the real betrayal in this house had never come from Clea at all. Daniel stepped back from the window slowly, careful not to make a sound, and walked to the edge of the porch where the shadows were deepest. He needed a moment before he could walk through that door and face his wife as though he had not just heard everything that mattered most in the past 3 months of his marriage. He set the folder down on the small wooden bench near the porch railing, the one Clea had bought 2 summers ago for reading outside on warm evenings, and pressed both hands against his face. He thought about knocking on the door right then and telling her everything, admitting he had overheard the call, pulling her into his arms and apologizing for every cold word he had spoken to her over the past 2 months. Part of him wanted that more than anything, but another part of him, the more cautious part, worried that if he confronted her now, in the middle of an already exhausting evening, she might feel ambushed rather than understood. She had said she wanted to tell him everything herself, on her own terms, this coming weekend. Perhaps the kindest thing he could do, after everything he had failed to notice about her these past months, was to let her have that moment when she was ready for it. Daniel picked the folder back up, tucked it beneath his jacket where it would not be immediately visible, and walked around to the side entrance near the garage instead of the front door, giving himself a few extra seconds to compose his expression before stepping inside. When he entered the kitchen a few minutes later, Claire was standing by the sink, running water over a mug, her back straighter now, her face carefully arranged into something calmer than what Daniel had witnessed through the window moments earlier. She looked up when she heard him come in and offered a small, tired smile. "Hey," she said, "you're back later than I expected." "Traffic," Daniel said, which was not entirely a lie, though it was far from the whole truth of where he had actually been that afternoon. He set his keys on the counter and studied her face for a moment, searching for any trace of the woman he had just heard pouring her heart out to her mother, exhausted and afraid and fiercely protective of him despite everything. He found only the same tired, guarded expression she had worn for weeks, the one he had so badly misread. "There's leftover chicken in the fridge if you're hungry," Claire said, turning off the tap. "I already ate something small before my shift, before I go to bed early tonight. I've got an early morning tomorrow." Daniel noticed the small slip in her words, the way she had almost said shift before catching herself, and felt a fresh wave of guilt at how easily he might have missed it entirely just a few hours earlier. Now every word carried new meaning. "Sure," he said. "I might just have something small." They moved around the kitchen in an uneasy quiet that had become familiar over the past several weeks, though tonight Daniel found himself watching Claire differently, noticing things he had overlooked before. The faint shadows beneath her eyes that makeup could only partially hide. The way she rubbed absently at her temple every few minutes, as though holding back a persistent headache. The stack of mail on the side table that included, Daniel now realized with a start, an envelope from the same bank that had sent the foreclosure warning to the shop, likely a follow-up notice Claire had intercepted before he ever saw it. "I think I'm going to head to bed early," Claire said after a while, setting her mug in the sink. "Long day." "Claire," Daniel said, before he could stop himself. She turned, eyebrows raised slightly, waiting. He almost told her everything right then. The words sat right at the edge of his tongue, the confession that he had overheard the entire phone call, that he understood now why she had been so distant, that he was sorrier than he could properly express for the folder currently tucked beneath his jacket in the hallway closet. But he caught himself at the last moment, remembering her voice through the window insisting she wanted to explain everything herself, in her own time, with real solutions in hand rather than half-formed apologies. "Nothing," he said instead. "Just get some rest. You look exhausted." Something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps at the gentleness in his tone after weeks of clipped, frustrated exchanges between them. "Thanks," she said quietly. "You too." After she disappeared down the hallway toward their bedroom, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. He thought about his father, about the shop on Corbin Avenue that had been passed down like a piece of family history, about how he had spent the past year quietly terrified of losing it without ever admitting that fear out loud to anyone, including Claire. He had assumed his silence was protecting her from worry. It had never occurred to him that his silence had simply left her to discover the danger on her own, and carry the burden of fixing it entirely by herself. He thought about Nathan too, his younger brother, and felt a cold twist of worry settle into his stomach at the mention of dangerous people expecting repayment. Nathan had always been reckless with money, prone to schemes that promised quick returns and rarely delivered, but Daniel had never imagined his brother's troubles could escalate to something involving threatening phone calls to his own home. That night, Daniel lay awake long after Claire's breathing had evened out into sleep beside him, staring at the ceiling, turning over every detail of the conversation he had overheard. He thought about the sapphire earrings sold to a stranger downtown, about overnight shifts taken in secret, about small withdrawals from their joint account meant to buy time with a bank that had nearly taken away his father's legacy without his knowledge. Every piece of evidence he had gathered against her over the past 2 months now told an entirely different story, one of quiet sacrifice rather than quiet betrayal. The next morning, Daniel woke before his alarm and found Claire already gone, a note on the kitchen counter explaining she had an early appointment and would be back by evening. Daniel showered, dressed for the shop, and instead of driving directly to Corbin Avenue as he did every morning, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of First Union Bank, the same bank whose warning letter he had shoved into his desk drawer months earlier. He waited nearly 40 minutes before a loan officer named Gregory Marsh could see him. When Daniel explained who he was and asked about the status of the loan on his shop, Gregory pulled up the account on his computer, his eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise. "Actually, Mr. Whitfield, your account is in better standing than I expected," Gregory said, scrolling through the details. "Your wife came in about 6 weeks ago and arranged a temporary payment plan along with a partial lump sum toward the principal. We agreed to hold off on any further action for 90 days while she worked with a financial advisor on a longer-term restructuring plan. The next payment under that plan is due in about 2 weeks. Daniel sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the confirmation of everything he had already suspected after last night. "Do you know how much she's paid toward it so far?" he asked. Gregory glanced at the screen again. "A little over $11,000, combined between the initial lump sum and the smaller monthly contribution since then," he said. "That's a significant amount to have put together in such a short time. Whatever she did to raise that, it clearly worked in your favor. The foreclosure proceedings that were originally scheduled to begin last month were suspended entirely once that payment came through." Daniel thanked Gregory and walked back out to his car in a daze, sitting behind the wheel for several long minutes before he could bring himself to start the engine. $11,000. Overnight shifts at a hospital front desk. A grandmother's sapphire earring sold to a stranger. All of it quietly assembled by his wife over the past 2 months, while he had been busy interpreting her exhaustion as indifference, her secrecy as betrayal, her sacrifice as the slow death of their marriage. He drove to the shop that morning but found it difficult to focus on anything, his mind circling back again and again to the conversation he had overheard the night before. Around midday, his brother Nathan called, and Daniel answered on the second ring, his heart pounding. "Hey," Nathan said, his voice unusually subdued. "Listen, is Claire around? I need to talk to her about something." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "She's not here right now," he said carefully. "But maybe you should talk to me instead, Nathan. What's going on?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "It's nothing," Nathan said finally, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "Just some stuff I'm handling. I'll call Claire later." "Nathan," Daniel said, his tone firmer now. "I know about the money you owe. I know people have been calling the house. I need you to tell me exactly what's going on right now, because I am not going to let you or Claire carry this alone anymore." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Daniel wondered if his brother had hung up entirely. When Nathan finally spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper, carrying a fear Daniel had never heard from him before in his life. "It started almost a year ago," Nathan said quietly. "I got involved with some guys who run private lending outside of any bank, quick cash for people who can't get approved through normal channels. I needed money fast for a business idea that fell apart within a few months, and by the time I realized how bad the interest was stacking up, I already owed more than I could ever pay back on my own." Daniel closed his eyes, pressing the phone tighter against his ear. "How much, Nathan?" "Almost 30,000, Nathan admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I've paid some of it down with help from Claire, but it's not enough. They gave me a deadline for the rest, the end of next month, and if I don't have it by then, they said things would get, I don't know, more serious than just phone calls." "What does more serious mean?" Daniel asked, though some cold part of him already suspected the answer. "They mentioned my car," Nathan said. "And they made it pretty clear it wouldn't stop there if I kept missing deadlines. I know how bad this sounds, Daniel. I know I should have come to you the moment this started instead of dragging Claire into it, but I was ashamed. You just lost Dad, you were trying to keep the shop running, and I didn't want to be one more problem landing on your desk." Daniel sat back in his chair at the shop, staring at the ceiling, feeling the full scope of what his wife had been quietly carrying settle over him with fresh, crushing clarity. Not only had she been secretly working to save his father's shop, she had also been trying to protect his brother from people who dealt in threats rather than paperwork. And she had done all of it without a single word of complaint directed at Daniel, despite how distracted and irritable he had become over the same 2 months. "Why Claire?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew part of the answer. "Why did you call her instead of me?" "Because she's the one who always keeps everyone calm," Nathan said. "You know that about her. Even when things are falling apart, she finds some way to make it feel manageable. I called her because I panicked, and she was the only person I trusted not to completely lose it on me before helping me figure out what to do." Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Okay," he said. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me everything, every name, every number, every deadline, and we are going to handle this together as a family starting today. No more secret payments. No more hiding this from me. Do you understand? There was a long pause before Nathan answered, his voice thick with something that sounded almost like relief. Yeah, he said. Okay, thank you, Daniel. I'm sorry I let it get this far without telling you. After the call ended, Daniel sat motionless at his desk for several minutes, absorbing everything that had unfolded in less than 24 hours. He thought about the folder of divorce papers still sitting in the hallway closet at home, the ink of his own signature already dried on the first page, and felt a fresh wave of shame at how close he had come to destroying his marriage over assumptions built entirely in the dark. He thought about calling Claire immediately, telling her everything, admitting he had overheard her conversation with Margaret the night before, and had spent the morning confirming every piece of it at the bank and on the phone with Nathan. Part of him wanted to do exactly that, to end the secrecy on both sides in one single conversation. But another part of him, the part that had watched her through the kitchen window fighting so hard to protect him from worry, felt she deserved to be the one who chose how. And when this conversation finally happened, especially after everything she had sacrificed to spare him additional stress. Instead, Daniel spent the rest of the afternoon quietly making calls of his own. He contacted a lawyer he knew through an old friend from college, not Patricia Doyle this time, but a different attorney who specialized in dealing with predatory private lenders, and set up an emergency consultation for the following morning to discuss Nathan's situation and what legal protections might be available. He called the financial advisor Claire had mentioned to her mother, introducing himself and asking, gently, whether there was anything more he could contribute now that he understood the full scope of the shop's restructuring plan. The advisor, a woman named Priya Anand, seemed surprised but relieved to finally speak directly with Daniel, and promised to prepare updated figures for both of them to review together. By the time Daniel closed the shop that evening, the sky had turned the same deep orange it had the night before, though this time he found himself noticing it, thinking briefly of how Claire used to stop and admire that exact color before pulling out her phone to take a picture. He drove home slowly, rehearsing in his mind exactly how he wanted to approach the conversation waiting for him once he walked through that door. He no longer wanted to wait for the weekend Claire had mentioned to her mother. Too much was already in motion. Too many threads had already been pulled loose over the course of a single day. And Daniel understood now that continuing to let his wife believe she was still protecting him from the truth would only prolong her exhaustion unnecessarily. Tonight, he decided, they would finally have the conversation that should have happened months earlier. The one where two people who loved each other stopped trying to shoulder impossible burdens alone and instead faced them together. When Daniel pulled into the driveway, Claire's car was already parked in its usual spot, and the porch light glowed warmly against the darkening sky. He sat in his car for a long moment, the folder of divorce papers no longer with him, left behind that morning in the hallway closet where it would stay, unsigned by Claire and never delivered. Tonight was not about ending anything. Tonight was about finally beginning the conversation his marriage had needed for months. Daniel walked through the front door and found Claire in the living room this time, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea cooling untouched on the side table, staring at her phone with an expression of quiet worry that she quickly tried to smooth away when she noticed him standing in the doorway. "Hey," she said, setting the phone face down beside her. "You're home a little early tonight." "I closed up a bit sooner than usual," Daniel said, walking further into the room and sitting down in the armchair across from her rather than his usual spot beside her on the couch, wanting to be able to see her face clearly for what he was about to say. "Claire, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to let me get through the whole thing before you respond, okay?" Something shifted in her expression immediately, a flicker of alarm crossing her tired features. "Okay," she said slowly, sitting up straighter. "You're scaring me a little." Daniel took a slow breath. Yesterday, before I came inside, I stood outside the door longer than I should have, he said. I heard you on the phone with your mother, Claire. I heard all of it. The bank letter, the overnight shifts at Larkspur, the earrings, Nathan, all of it. Claire's face went pale, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, her hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion so tightly her knuckles turned white. You heard everything, she repeated quietly, more to herself than to him. Yes, Daniel said. And Claire, I need you to know something before we go any further. Yesterday afternoon, before I came home, I had already been to see a lawyer. I had divorce papers signed and ready to give you last night. Claire's breath caught audibly, her eyes widening with a hurt so raw that Daniel felt it like a physical blow. You were going to leave me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I was, Daniel admitted, forcing himself not to look away from her despite how badly he wanted to soften the truth. I thought you were having an affair, Claire. I thought the missed dinners, the secret phone calls, the missing money, all of it meant you had checked out of this marriage and were preparing to leave. I built an entire story in my head based on nothing but assumptions, and I nearly ended everything we have without ever once asking you directly what was really going on. Tears had already begun sliding down Claire's cheeks, and she made no effort to wipe them away. I never meant for you to feel like I was pulling away from you, she said, her voice trembling. Everything I did, every single secret, every excuse I made. It was all because I love you too much to watch you lose the last piece of your father you had left, and I was terrified of what it would do to you if you found out how close we came to losing it. I know that now, Daniel said gently. I went to the bank this morning, Claire. I spoke to Gregory Marsh. I know about the $11,000. I know you sold your grandmother's earrings. I talked to Nathan too, and he told me everything about the money he owes and the people he owes it to. Claire pressed both hands over her face for a moment, her shoulders shaking with quiet, exhausted sobs. I wanted to tell you everything this weekend, she said through her hands. I wanted to walk in with actual solutions instead of just more bad news for you to carry. I didn't want you to feel like all I ever brought into this house anymore was stress and problems. Daniel rose from the armchair and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling in front of the couch so he could take her hands gently in his own. Claire, look at me, he said softly. When she finally lowered her hands and met his eyes, he continued, his own voice thick with emotion. You have never once been a burden to me, not for one single day of our marriage. What you did these past 2 months, working yourself to exhaustion, selling something that mattered deeply to you, carrying my brother's crisis on top of everything else, all without a single complaint directed at me, that is not the behavior of someone pulling away from her marriage. That is the behavior of someone who loves her husband more fiercely than he ever deserved credit for noticing. Claire's breath hitched, and she squeezed his hands tightly. I was so scared you'd think I was hiding an affair, she admitted. I saw the way you looked at me some mornings, like you were trying to figure out who I even was anymore. I knew something had shifted between us, but I didn't know how to fix it without also telling you things I wasn't ready for you to carry yet. I'm sorry, Daniel said, his own eyes stinging now. I'm sorry I let assumptions build up in the dark instead of asking you directly what was happening. I'm sorry I let 2 months pass without once considering that the distance between us might be born out of love rather than the absence of it. They sat together in silence for a moment, Claire's hand still held tightly in his own, the weight of everything finally spoken aloud settling over the room like something both heavy and strangely liberating. Then, from the side table, Claire's phone buzzed sharply against the wood, the sound cutting through the fragile quiet they had just built together. Claire glanced at the screen and her face immediately drained of what little color had returned to it. It's Nathan, she said, picking it up with visibly shaking hands. She answered on speaker without thinking, her voice tight with sudden fear. Nathan, what's wrong? Nathan's voice came through the small speaker, breathless and clearly frightened. Claire, they're outside my apartment right now, he said. Two of them standing by a car across the street. They said if I don't have the rest of the money by tomorrow morning instead of the end of the month like we agreed, they're not waiting anymore. They said tomorrow or things get bad. Daniel felt every muscle in his body go tense at once. Nathan, it's Daniel. I'm on the phone too. Do not go outside. Lock every door and window in your apartment right now and stay away from the windows facing the street. Daniel, Nathan said, his voice cracking with panic. I don't have that kind of money by tomorrow. I don't even have half of it. What am I supposed to do? You're not doing anything alone, Daniel said firmly, standing up now, his mind already racing through options. Stay inside. Do not answer the door for anyone and do not go anywhere near that car outside. I'm calling the lawyer I spoke with today, and then Claire and I are coming to your apartment together. We are going to figure this out tonight, all three of us. Claire had already risen from the couch, grabbing her coat from the hook by the front door, her earlier tears replaced now by a fierce, focused determination that Daniel recognized instantly as the same strength that had carried her through 2 months of secret sacrifice. Nathan, listen to me, Claire said into the phone, her voice steadier now despite the fear still evident beneath it. Do exactly what Daniel said. Lock everything, stay away from the windows, and call the police non-emergency line right now to report that men have been watching your building and made a threat against you. Tell them everything, don't leave anything out. We will be there within the hour. Okay, Nathan said, his voice slightly calmer now that he had clear instructions to follow rather than facing the situation alone. Okay, I'm doing it right now. The call ended, and Daniel turned to find Claire already pulling on her coat, her keys in hand, her expression a mixture of fear and unshakable resolve. We need to call your attorney friend on the way, she said. The one you mentioned meeting with, for private lending situations like this. And I think we should call the police ourselves too, not just tell Nathan to do it, in case there's something more we need to report from our end about the calls that came to this house. Daniel nodded, grabbing his own jacket, momentarily struck by how naturally Claire had stepped into crisis mode, organizing their next steps with the same clear-headed determination she had apparently shown for months while managing the bank, the overnight shifts, and Nathan's growing debt entirely on her own. I called the lawyer yesterday, Grant Ashworth, Daniel said, pulling out his phone as they hurried toward the car. He specializes in exactly this kind of predatory lending situation. I have a consultation scheduled with him tomorrow morning, but I'll call him now and see if he can advise us on what to do tonight instead. They climbed into Daniel's car, and as he backed quickly out of the driveway, Claire dialed the non-emergency police line with one hand while holding her seatbelt steady with the other, her voice remarkably composed as she explained the situation to the dispatcher, providing Nathan's address and a description of the threat that had just been relayed to them over the phone. Daniel drove faster than he normally would, weaving carefully but urgently through the evening traffic, his mind cycling rapidly between fear for his brother's safety and a strange, aching gratitude for the woman sitting beside him, calmly coordinating their response to a crisis that, only 24 hours earlier, he had known nothing about at all. Grant, Daniel said into his phone once the call connected, putting it on speaker so Claire could hear as well. It's Daniel Whitfield. I know we're set to meet tomorrow morning, but something urgent has come up tonight. My brother is being threatened by private lenders outside his apartment right now. Grant Ashworth's voice came through clear and steady, the voice of someone accustomed to handling exactly this kind of emergency. All right, Daniel, first thing, has your brother contacted the police yet? Yes, just now, Daniel said. My wife is on the line with them right now. Good, Grant said. That's the most important step. These operations rely heavily on intimidation rather than actual legal enforcement, because what they're doing is illegal lending in the first place. A documented police report changes the entire dynamic, because it puts them on record as making threats, which they cannot afford if they want to avoid serious legal trouble themselves. Have your brother request an officer be sent to check the area immediately, not just take a report over the phone. Understood, Daniel said, glancing at Claire, who nodded and immediately relayed the request to the dispatcher still on the line with her. Second, Grant continued, do not, under any circumstances, attempt to pay these people directly tonight, even if you have the funds available. Any direct payment made under duress like this can actually complicate things legally and may not even stop further demands. Get your brother somewhere safe first. Let the police handle tonight's immediate threat, and we will address the debt itself properly tomorrow morning through legitimate channels. Daniel felt a measure of relief at the clarity of Grant's instructions, grateful to have concrete guidance to follow rather than facing the unfolding crisis with nothing but fear and improvisation. Thank you, Grant, he said. We'll call you again once we know more. As Daniel ended the call, Claire reached over and placed her hand gently on his arm, her earlier fear now tempered by something steadier. We're going to get through this, she said quietly. All of it, Nathan, the shop, everything. We're going to get through it together this time. Daniel glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road, feeling something settle in his chest that had been missing for months. A fragile but undeniable sense that whatever came next, he would not be facing it alone, and neither would she. When they arrived at Nathan's apartment building 20 minutes later, a single patrol car was already parked near the entrance, its lights casting a slow, rotating glow across the darkened street. Daniel felt a wave of relief at the sight of it, quickly followed by a fresh surge of worry as he scanned the area for any sign of the men Nathan had described earlier. I don't see another car, Clea said quietly, peering out the window as Daniel parked. Maybe they left once they saw the police arrive. They hurried inside and found Nathan standing in the small lobby with a young police officer, his face pale but visibly calmer than he had sounded over the phone. He turned when he saw them and crossed the room quickly, pulling Daniel into a brief, tight embrace before doing the same with Clea. They drove off about 10 minutes before the officer got here, Nathan said, his voice still slightly unsteady. I watched from the window like you said. I don't think they saw me, but I definitely saw them leave once another car pulled up down the street. I don't know if it scared them off or if it was just a coincidence. The officer, whose nameplate read Delgado, stepped forward and addressed Daniel and Clea directly. I've taken a full report from your brother, she said. He described the vehicle and gave us what details he could about the two men involved. Given the nature of the threat and the fact that this appears to be connected to an unlicensed private lending situation, I'm going to recommend this gets escalated to our financial crimes unit first thing tomorrow morning. In situations like this, once these operations know law enforcement is actively involved and documenting their behavior, they tend to back off rather than risk further exposure. What should we do in the meantime? Clea asked. Is Nathan safe staying here tonight? Officer Delgado considered the question for a moment. I'd recommend he not stay alone tonight, more as a precaution than anything else, she said. If you have room for him to stay with you, that would be the safest option until we can follow up further tomorrow. I'll also make sure a patrol car swings by this building periodically overnight, just to be thorough. Nathan looked over at Daniel and Clea, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and quiet embarrassment. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry I let this get so far without telling you, and I'm sorry you're both dealing with this now because of my mistakes. Daniel placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. We'll talk about all of that later, he said. Right now, let's just get you somewhere safe for tonight. Grab whatever you need for a day or two and let's go. The drive back to Daniel and Clea's house felt entirely different from the tense, urgent drive to Nathan's apartment less than an hour earlier. Nathan sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window, while Clea reached over and laced her fingers through Daniel's free hand resting on the center console, A small, simple gesture that carried more comfort than words could have offered after everything the day had brought. Once they arrived home and settled Nathan into the guest room with a spare blanket and pillow, Daniel and Clea finally found themselves alone again in the kitchen. The same kitchen where, less than 24 hours earlier, Daniel had stood frozen outside the window listening to a conversation that changed everything he thought he understood about his marriage. "Today has been a lot," Clea said quietly, leaning against the counter, her exhaustion now visible in every line of her posture. "It has," Daniel agreed, stepping closer to her. "But Clea, I need you to know something. Whatever happens with Nathan's situation, whatever it takes to sort out the shop's finances properly, none of it changes what I decided the moment I understood what you'd actually been doing these past 2 months." "What's that?" Clea asked softly. "That I am not letting you carry anything alone again," Daniel said. "Not the shop, not Nathan, not anything. From now on, whatever comes at us, we face it together, the way we should have been doing all along." Clea's eyes filled with fresh tears, though these carried none of the exhaustion or fear of earlier in the evening. She stepped into his arms, and for the first time in what felt like months, Daniel felt the familiar warmth of his wife holding him without hesitation, without the invisible wall of secrecy that had stood quietly between them for so long. "I threw away the folder," Daniel murmured into her hair. "This morning, before I left for the bank, I couldn't stand the thought of it sitting in that closet another day." Clea pulled back slightly to look up at him, a small, watery laugh escaping her despite everything. "I'm glad," she said, "because I don't think I could have survived losing you on top of everything else." They stood together in the quiet kitchen for a long moment, the events of the day still settling around them, aware that tomorrow would bring its own set of difficult conversations with lawyers, financial advisors, and Nathan's ongoing troubles, but grateful, for the first time in months, that they would be facing all of it side by side rather than in silent, separate struggle. The following morning began earlier than usual, with all three of them gathered around the kitchen table before sunrise, going over the events of the previous night while waiting for a call back from Grant Ashworth. Nathan looked pale and drawn, having slept poorly on the unfamiliar guest bed, but there was a steadiness in his voice that had not been there the night before, a quiet resolve to finally face the consequences of his mistakes rather than continue hiding from them. "I want to be completely honest with both of you about everything," Nathan said, wrapping both hands around a mug of coffee Clea had made for him. "The full amount I owe, where it came from, all of it. No more half-truths." Over the next hour, Nathan laid out the entire situation in detail, describing how a failed investment in a friend's delivery startup had led him to borrow from an unlicensed lender, promising quick approval and flexible terms, only for the interest to balloon far beyond what he had ever anticipated. He explained how he had made partial payments for months using money from odd jobs and a small inheritance from their father, but had eventually fallen behind, prompting the escalating threats that had brought them all to this point. When Grant called back shortly after 8, he listened carefully to the full account before offering his assessment. "Based on what you've described, this lending arrangement was almost certainly illegal from the start," he said. "Unlicensed lenders using threats to enforce repayment open themselves up to serious legal consequences, which actually gives us significant leverage here. I'd like to help Nathan file a formal complaint with the Financial Crimes Unit today, and I can also draft correspondence to these lenders making clear that any further contact or threats will result in immediate legal action against them specifically, rather than continued informal negotiation." Over the following 2 weeks, the situation with Nathan's debt began to resolve far more smoothly than any of them had expected. The police report from that first frightening night, combined with Grant's formal legal correspondence, appeared to spook the lenders significantly, and the threatening calls stopped entirely within days. Grant negotiated a reduced settlement figure with the lenders directly, using the clear illegality of their operation as leverage, ultimately bringing the debt down to a fraction of what Nathan had originally believed he owed. Between funds Nathan managed to gather from selling his car and a modest loan from Daniel and Clea that they all agreed would be repaid on a clear, documented schedule, the debt was fully settled within the month, and Nathan moved back to his own apartment with a newfound seriousness about managing his finances more carefully going forward. The shop situation took a bit longer to fully stabilize, but with Daniel now fully aware of the challenges Clea had been quietly managing for months, they were able to work through it as partners rather than Clea carrying the weight alone. Priya Anand, the financial advisor Clea had originally consulted in secret, helped them restructure the remaining loan on the shop into a more manageable long-term payment plan, while Daniel began implementing changes at Cobbin Avenue that he had been avoiding out of pride, including renegotiating terms with the supplier who had raised prices unexpectedly, and adjusting the shop's hours to reduce unnecessary overhead costs during slower periods. Claire, for her part, gave notice at Larkspur Medical Center once the immediate financial pressure eased, though she maintained a friendly relationship with several of the coworkers she had met during those exhausting overnight shifts, occasionally mentioning how strange it felt now to sleep through an entire night without waking at odd hours out of habit. One evening, about 6 weeks after that first terrifying night at Nathan's apartment, Daniel came home from the shop to find Claire sitting at the kitchen table, a small velvet box in front of her that Daniel immediately recognized. "I went back to the buyer downtown," Claire said, smiling as Daniel approached the table. "I told him the circumstances had changed, and I asked if there was any way to buy the earrings back. He remembered me, actually, said not many people come back for pieces once they're sold, and he'd kept them in a separate display case rather than melting them down for the stones, in case something like this ever happened." Daniel opened the box slowly, finding the delicate sapphire earrings resting inside exactly as Claire had described them weeks earlier, the ones her grandmother had placed in her hands years before their wedding day. "Claire, this must have cost you a fortune to buy back," he said. "It did," Claire admitted, "but it felt important somehow, especially now that we're facing everything together instead of separately. I wanted to have them back, not just for myself, but as something we recovered as a family the same way we're recovering everything else." Daniel closed the box gently and set it down, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I keep thinking about that night," he said. "Standing outside the window, listening to you talk to your mother, realizing everything I had assumed about you was wrong. I think about how close I came to handing you those papers before ever giving you the chance to explain." "I think about it too," Claire admitted. "I keep wondering what would have happened if you had walked in and given me those papers before I had the chance to tell you everything myself. I don't know if I would have found the words fast enough to explain in that moment, not with everything else already so overwhelming." "We're not going to let something like that happen again," Daniel said firmly. "No more carrying things alone, no matter how much we think we're protecting each other by doing it. From now on, whatever comes up, we talk about it, even when it's difficult, even when it feels easier to stay quiet." Claire nodded, squeezing his hand. "I want that too," she said. "I think I convinced myself that protecting you meant keeping you from ever having to worry about anything, but real protection isn't carrying everything alone. It's trusting the person beside you enough to let them help carry it with you." Over the following months, their marriage settled into something steadier and more honest than it had been in years, built on the kind of hard-won understanding that only comes from nearly losing something and recognizing, just in time, what had actually been happening beneath the surface all along. Daniel made a point of asking Claire directly about anything that seemed to be weighing on her, rather than allowing assumptions to quietly build in the space between them, and Claire, in turn, learned to share difficult truths earlier, trusting that Daniel could handle far more than she had once believed. Nathan visited often in the months that followed, his relationship with both his brother and Claire noticeably closer after everything they had gone through together, and he made a point of thanking Claire on more than one occasion for standing by him during the worst of his crisis, even at personal cost to her own peace of mind. On the anniversary of that terrifying night at Nathan's apartment, exactly 1 year later, Daniel and Claire sat together on their back porch, watching the same kind of deep orange sunset that had colored the sky on the evening everything had nearly fallen apart between them. Claire wore the sapphire earrings, catching the last light of the day as she leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how differently things could have gone?" Claire asked quietly. "All the time," Daniel admitted. "But I think about how things actually did go even more. We almost lost each other over silence, over both of us trying to protect one another by keeping the hardest truths hidden. I don't ever want to make that mistake again." Claire smiled softly, watching the last colors of the sunset fade into evening. "Neither do I," she said. "Whatever comes next, we face it together, out loud from the very beginning." Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the sky darkened above their small house on Ferndale Street. Two people who had come dangerously close to losing everything over assumptions and silence, now bound more closely together by the honest, difficult truths they had finally learned to share with one another. The shop on Corbin Avenue stood secure behind them, Nathan's debt long since resolved through honest daylight dealings rather than desperate secret ones, and the marriage that had nearly ended in a lawyer's office instead grew into something far sturdier than either of them had believed possible just 1 year earlier, built not on the absence of hardship, but on the shared, unwavering choice to face every hardship side by side. A few weeks after the earrings were returned to Claire, Margaret came to visit for the first time since everything had unfolded, arriving with a small suitcase and an unusually nervous expression as Daniel greeted her at the door. She had spoken to Daniel briefly on the phone before the visit, an awkward but necessary conversation in which she admitted she had encouraged Claire for weeks to consider leaving him, believing at the time that he was simply an inattentive husband unwilling to notice his wife's struggles. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said once she had settled into the living room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea Claire had prepared for her. "I told my daughter more than once that she deserved better than watching herself disappear while trying to protect a husband who didn't even seem to notice the effort. I didn't understand then how much you didn't know, because she was working so hard to keep it that way." Daniel sat across from her, choosing his words carefully. "You don't owe me an apology," he said. "You were watching your daughter exhaust herself and worry about her, exactly the way any mother should. I'm the one who should have been paying closer attention long before any of this reached a breaking point." Margaret studied him for a long moment, something in her expression softening. "She told me on the phone, after everything settled, that you overheard our entire conversation that night," she said. "I have to admit, when she told me, my first thought was that it must have been humiliating for her, having something so private overheard that way. But she said it was the opposite. She said hearing it seemed to be exactly what finally made you understand her." "It was," Daniel said quietly. "I've thought about that 100 times since. If I hadn't paused outside that door, if I had simply walked in and handed her those papers like I planned, I don't know how any of this would have gone. I'm grateful, in a strange way, that I stopped to listen." Later that evening, while Claire walked her mother through the newly renovated section of the shop's finances on her laptop, showing her the restructuring plan Priya Anand had helped them finalize, Daniel stepped outside onto the porch, standing near the same spot where he had once stood frozen, listening through a window to words that changed the direction of his entire marriage. The bench where he had set down the folder of divorce papers still sat in the same place, though its meaning had shifted entirely in his mind, no longer a marker of the worst night of his marriage, but of the night everything finally began to heal. Nathan called that same week with news that he had started a modest but stable job managing inventory for a regional distribution company, a position far less glamorous than the failed delivery startup that had originally led him into debt, but one that came with a steady paycheck, and more importantly, no risk of the kind of desperate borrowing that had nearly gotten him seriously hurt. He mentioned, almost sheepishly, that he had also started setting aside a small amount from every paycheck specifically to repay Daniel and Claire ahead of the agreed schedule, determined to prove that the trust they had placed in him during the worst weeks of his life had not been misplaced. "You didn't have to do that," Daniel told him over the phone. "We agreed on a schedule that worked for everyone." "I know," Nathan said, "but I want to. You and Claire didn't just bail me out that night. You showed up for me when I didn't deserve it, and I don't want that kind of trust to ever feel like it was wasted on me." Months turned into a full year, and the small house on Ferndale Street settled into a rhythm neither Daniel nor Claire had known in years, one built on open conversation rather than careful avoidance. Daniel found himself calling Claire during quiet moments at the shop simply to share small updates, a habit he had let slip away sometime after his father's death. And Claire, in turn, began mentioning small worries and frustrations as they arose rather than letting them accumulate silently, until they became overwhelming secrets to manage alone. The shop on Corbin Avenue, once teetering on the edge of foreclosure, slowly regained its footing, helped along by a renewed sense of community support once regular customers noticed Daniel's more consistent presence and friendlier demeanor behind the counter. No longer distracted by private financial anxiety he had once carried entirely alone. Claire occasionally stopped by during her lunch break from her new position at a local accounting firm, a job she had taken partly because the stable daytime hours meant she and Daniel finally shared the same schedule for the first time since their wedding. On a quiet Sunday morning, almost exactly 1 year after that frightening night outside Nathan's apartment, Daniel and Claire sat together at their kitchen table, the same table where so many difficult conversations had unfolded over the previous months, now simply enjoying coffee and the unhurried quiet of a morning, with nothing urgent demanding their attention. "Do you remember what I told my mother that night, right before I hung up the phone?" Claire asked, glancing up from her coffee. Daniel thought back, recalling the words he had overheard through the kitchen window with painful clarity even now. "You said everything you'd done was for me, even if I never found out," he said. Claire nodded slowly. "I think about that a lot," she said. "How wrong I was to believe that protecting you meant keeping you in the dark. I understand now that the version of protection I was practicing back then wasn't really protection at all. It was just fear, dressed up as love." "And now?" Daniel asked gently. Claire reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Now I think real love looks a lot more like what we're doing right now," she said. "Sitting here, talking about hard things without flinching from them, trusting each other enough to carry things together instead of quietly disappearing under the weight of trying to carry them alone." Daniel squeezed her hand, looking at the woman across from him with a depth of appreciation he had nearly lost the chance to fully understand. Outside, the morning sun spilled gently across the small kitchen where, exactly 1 year earlier, a marriage had nearly ended over silence and assumption, and had instead been given the rarest kind of second chance, one built not on the absence of difficulty, but on the shared, unwavering choice two people had finally made to face every difficulty honestly together from that moment forward.